So I kindly ask Professor Schanda to give his presentation.
How much time do I have?
Some 25 minutes.
25 minutes, okay. Just to leave some time for questions or comments, but I'll try to keep it short. Well, one of the things people usually love about Budapest is the skyline. That we have no skyscrapers in town. The two tallest buildings in the Pest side are the House of Parliament and St. Stephen's Basilica. And they are both 96 meters tall, symbolizing an equilibrium between church and state. And there shall be no taller building than them in town, except of some exceptions, because some may be more equal than others. And a unique exception that was meant to be a really unique exception is the construction of Mool campus. So Mool is the national oil company, which is 100% privately owned by now, but it's not just seen as one of the oil companies active in the country. It has clearly a strategic importance for Hungary. So Mool got the permission to construct a skyscraper 120 meters tall. It's for our scale, that's a skyscraper. To construct a skyscraper in the south of Buda, well, already a bit south of the Southern Railway Bridge, which is not the center anymore, but still the building will be seen from downtown Pest. So it's not somewhere in the outskirts, but it will be a visible building, changing the skyline of the city. Well, one of the interesting things about the pandemic and having a strategic type of thinking was that in March, when the first wave of the pandemic has reached the country, there was shortage of everything people so to be needed to combat, to fight the pandemic. One of the shortages was related to disinfective liquids and for use for disinfection. So Mool was asked, and they very rapidly reacted to provide disinfective material for the public. They changed a factory that is normally producing windscreen washing liquid into a factory producing disinfectives. The first experiments allegedly had a disastrous smell. They were smelling like low quality palinka and making having a very special odor, a very special smell of third class pub. Well, the disinfective Mool is producing is not a well smelling disinfective, but anyway, they very rapidly managed to cope with the challenge and began to sell and to distribute their disinfective. And one of the target groups, and they did not make public, this policy has not been made public, was the religious communities. At that time, in spring 2020, last year, there was a huge market demand. People were ready to pay, for stuff like this. But religious communities who were, let us say, on good ties with coping with or active in public services, they got disinfectives free of charge. Interestingly, Mool has made it public that they were distributing this liquid for charities, but they have never announced have never made any public announcement on distributing it to religious communities, but they still did. What this little example shows that, well, seemingly there is a provision applicable to all, no building taller than 96 meters, but there is an exception. Seemingly, market is deciding on lots of issues, but there are exceptions. And one of the exceptions, when other rules override the market, one of the exceptions can be a pandemic. It raises a number of interesting and symbolic questions. Who has access to this type of privileged treatment, special benefit? Hungary has been hit by 3 waves of the pandemic, and by now probably most of us would agree that we have overreacted the first wave of the pandemic. We had a very severe lockdown, hardly any, very few lives lost, and a very low infection rate. Contrary to that, the second and the third wave has hit the country much stronger, but probably the general public has learned something from the first wave, and measures taken by the government, although the government got all the power to take adequate measures, have been much less severe than previously. There is, in the first wave, there was a sharp, the lockdown has been much more severe in the first wave than in the second or even in the third wave, despite of higher losses and a higher risk to health and life. Maybe 2 common features of measures the government has taken that could be different than in many other countries around, was that measures in Hungary were usually, in my humble judgment, they were fairly simple. So they didn't make very complicated measures, and they were hardly changing. We did not make red and orange and green zones, and a number of countries have changed the rules from town to town, from county to county. And one week museums were open, next week they were closed. One week schools were open, next week they were closed, and vice versa. We had relatively few changes in the policy, so there was a kind of a stability with regard to the policy, and a relatively low number of restrictions were applied. Well, one of the differences the present constitution has against the previous one is that the previous one, when that was in force until the text was in force from 1989 to 2011, that the previous one didn't allow the curtailment of religious freedom in emergency regimes, whereas the present constitution allows curtailing or even suspending religious freedom like any other fundamental right, except of the right of life and dignity and a handful of other rights. But previously, the freedom of religion under the previous constitution was among the privileged rights that couldn't be limited under no circumstance, whereas nowadays religious freedom enjoys the same kind of constitutional protection as free speech or the freedom of assembly or any other fundamental rights and freedoms we usually enjoy. Notwithstanding this difference, when the government has decided to suspend a number of rights, probably the most visible comparison could be made to the freedom of assembly. The freedom of assembly has been suspended as such, no demonstrations at all. They did not limit in any ways the activity, the public activity of religious communities. Religious communities were merely called upon to find appropriate, to meet appropriate action. And it can be a surprise or not, they all have adopted similar measures than the government has adopted in other fields of life. When there was a lockdown, then public worship has been suspended. When the lockdown was eased, then public worship was eased as well. But this has been a policy adopted by the religious communities themselves, and although the government could have had restrictive measures, and religious communities would have to follow them, to obey them, the government did not adopt restrictive measures with regard to the free exercise of religion, public worship. That's probably the most sensitive issue, but has left this to the discretion of religious communities, and religious communities acted, let us say, in a responsible way, where one could say. Although there were significant differences between denominations, even and these may even be some, in a way or another, even funny. Part of them are certainly dictated by theological differences. Last Easter, when we had a strict lockdown and practically no religious community had any kind of public worship, despite the low infection rates. So last Easter 2020, the Reformed Church, the Calvinist Church, generally suggested, leaving the discretion certainly to the faithful and the congregations, that the head of the family should break the bread after watching the service on television or on the internet. The Lutheran Church, that is in intercommunion with the Calvinist Church, the Lutheran Church pronounced the policy that this practice would be strictly violating their principles, and breaking the bread should be reserved to ordained ministers, and a simple family father shouldn't dare to do this. Certainly the question doesn't apply, or would not make sense to Catholics, but there were even when the attitude of religious communities has also been slightly different when we look at different waves and different approaches they have adopted. Generally, one could say that that Catholics were braver, or they have opted for more encounter, whereas Protestants were more careful in their approach. Certainly, what makes the comparison difficult is that the Catholic Church has its hierarchical structure. Certainly, there are differences from diocese to diocese, but at least in one diocese, there is a diocesan policy, whereas with Protestant churches, usually the autonomy of local congregations prevail. But this attitude that Sine Dominico non postumus, there has to be Eucharist on a Sunday. There is no a Sunday without a Eucharist is not a real Sunday. this has remained as a fairly exclusive Catholic policy, and seemingly this has been the last thing the Catholic Church wanted to give up, and it has been left as an ultimate measure. Still, we have the policy of hand communion, and mouth communion shouldn't be exercised except of Greek Catholics, so Eastern Rite Catholics, but in the Latin Church there shall be no mouth communion. But compare this to the Lutheran Church, it's interesting that the two central decisions they have made was that there shall be no singing at church and no communion at church. So just the liturgy of words, just the gospel and the homily. Listen to it from at home. What has made what could have been the reason of having a preferential treatment for religious activities, more freedom than to others? Would that say that what you have just said before, that is there a value judgment or religion behind, or anything like that? Is there a reason government has treated differently religious activities, meeting people for public worship, than any other activity, like a cultural activity, a concert, or a sports event? Well, one of the reasons, and this may be kind of fragile, but it could make sense up to a certain degree, was that there was an idea that creating bubbles could be reasonable to limit the pandemic. And whereas for a sports event or a concert, people from different parts of the city would gather. You usually go to the same church every week, and it is a bubble. It's like your workplace, or like the school of your kids, but you don't mingle. You wouldn't go 1 week to one church and the next week to another one. Italians, in fact, had a provision that every Catholic should go to the local parish. So no tourism, parish tourism, just for better music or a better sermon, but go to the nearest one. But we had no such policy, but this could make a difference to another type of an event. Another reason could be a historic one. Religious communities have been known for a kind of responsibility. Even centuries before, when similar pandemics have happened, religious communities have been there, and we have the previous policies can be opened. You can look it up in the Historia Domus of the local parish, how they have handled the Spanish flu 100 years ago. There were policies available, and a historic experience not shared by football clubs or other institutions. But probably the main reason has been a kind of trust, a kind of spirit of cooperation between religious communities and the government for the public good. It is a separation system between religious communities and the state, but for the public good, church and state, religious communities and the state, religious communities and the government should cooperate, and there should be a permanent contact between them. I wouldn't use the orthodox term of a symphony, but something like that should be there. But another approach to the same distinctions would be that there is no rational explanation, and similar to the fact that Hungary has closed down at the first wave of the pandemic dentistries. You couldn't see your dentist, but you could go to the hairdresser. Germany has closed down the hairdressers, but you could see your dentist. Well, what's the rationale beyond it? We have all undergone a social experiment, and it's really not reasonable to look at measures one by one, because measures one by one may seem to be irrational. They may seem to be results of an overreaction. They maybe they don't hold when you make when you try to make a judgment about balancing competing rights and interests. But the general picture should have a message of rationality that can apply to the everyday citizen in a way that the everyday citizen should feel that it's rational to cooperate. It's even if the police is not there, you should obey the provisions. So but at the end of the day, probably we have to we have to confess that that many measures that we were experimenting with, or the government or religious communities were experimenting with, had no rational basis. They just had the message of cooperating. They just had the message that, well, you should have an awareness. You should take care. Maybe what you are doing is senseless, but when it bears the spirit of taking care of others, when it is when it has this positive attitude towards the community, then it is still valuable, and at the end of the day, at the end of the pandemic, we have to regard all the package as one single package, and this package may contain elements that were probably just results of an ad hoc decision. It may have elements that were just results of overreaction. It may even have elements that were counterproductive, but there is no possibility of making a counter test. It is a unique challenge. It has been a unique challenge, and we have to take the risk of making, or we had to take the risk of making wrong decisions, and of experimenting. Maybe what I'm saying is not so much from a legal perspective, because when it comes to a court decision, then we have at the court a concrete measure that has to be examined, and we have to decide whether a general ban on demonstrations can hold or not. But I'm slightly tempted to the perspective that in certain issues, and one of them was probably what we have experienced over the last year. You can't expect the legislator to be 100% rational and to make the right decisions. What makes it? Why should we talk about this when all this is just about or partly about taking or handling a crisis with a lot of with a number of ad hoc decisions that haven't been really tested, etc. Probably our generation has never confronted anything like this, and such a kind of an emergency hasn't been here since the last 70 years. Maybe for Hungary, it was the revolution of 1956, the last period when we had a serious emergency. Generations don't remember that anymore. But probably there should be a lesson learned for the next crisis. And we don't know what type of challenge the next generation will be confronted to, but probably it would make sense to study the package as a whole to learn the lesson for the future. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for emphasizing the rationality of the regulations. I was wondering if we were the country with good haircut and bad teeth. Germany is just the opposite. So, well, we'll see.